morning. This is Richard Cheng with the Sativa Segment. Welcome to episode 7. Before we get started, I'd like to say that this episode is fueled by Dads at Peace. Dads at Peace is a men's resource center based in Dallas, Texas. If you would like to find out more about it, go ahead and look it up on Facebook, Dads at Peace, and you can find out more information about its meetings and its events. Today, we have a guest in the industrial hemp industry. His name is Colte Koen of Cellulogyx, and he's the CEO there. But really, this individual, who I've known for a while, he also is involved with a number of other ventures, which we'll discuss.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Hey, good to see you again, man. It's been a while.
It's been a while, yeah.
What was that, 2015?
2015. So we met each other, and then shortly after that, you came to the law firm I was with.
Yeah.
We had a big oil and gas event, which you were in the oil and gas.
Yeah.
It was at the ballpark.
The ballpark, yeah. I remember you guys had a nice little suite there. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a great event. It was a great firm. That firm is no longer around, but so I guess we've known each other for a while.
Yeah, man. I think you were doing your MBA at the time, right?
I was.
Yeah.
And you suggested SMU, but I didn't have the coin for it.
Well, I mean, who does, right? I mean, at the end of the day. But where did you end up doing your MBA at?
At University of Memphis.
How was it?
No, it was a lot of fun. It took me 4.5 years, but I was taking one class at a time, working full time, practicing law full time, and it was. I learned a lot.
Did you keep in touch with anyone from the program?
Yeah, actually, one of my clients and one of my really good friends is actually here in town. There's actually 2 or 3 classmates.
Yeah,
from that program.
Yeah. I honestly, having done the MBA program now, like I think that the I don't want to say the only, but I'd say the primary value, really, at the end of the day, is the networking, the network that you build, right? I mean,
I've heard that from everybody.
I'm really like when people are super proud of their MBA, I kind of like,
there were 2 or 3 classes that were pretty tough, right? Like finance was tough, corporate finance was tough, econ was tough, global operations was stats was but I think you're right. I mean, I think value is like the people you meet in.
Yeah, like I think it's one of those things where, hey, you know what? I can appreciate that you went above and beyond, and went and challenged yourself, and I think that's respectable and stuff like that. SMU was great. It's a highly regarded school and all those things, and I think the classes were interesting, and we had a lot of good adjunct professors who came in from that real world, and it was great. And some of my closest friends today are guys that I met in the MBA program. Yeah. And so I'm very thankful for that. And I went to my MBA because I had moved to Dallas I think just the year prior, and really just didn't have a network, didn't have friends. I had lost my ass in the housing market in Houston. Yeah. And so when I lost everything, one of the first times I lost everything, I just packed up my truck and moved to Dallas. And
where are you from?
I'm originally from Arlington.
Okay.
But, in Arlington, we don't really consider that Dallas because...
Is it more Fort Worth? Or is it in between?
It's its own thing, right? Okay. So Arlington is a town, like at the time that I was there, we had 5 5A high schools.
Lamar, Martin.
Yeah, Arlington High, Bowie. Yeah, Sam. So... Are you from Arlington?
No. I've had a lot of friends in Arlington, and I know Arlington is kind of its own little identity.
Well, yeah, because for us, Fort Worth was kind of Western, and Dallas is where people with money lived, right?
Sure.
So like we never went. It was just like we were living in basically South Central Arlington, and it was a little rough. There may have been metal detectors to get into my junior high sometimes, but
give it character.
Yeah, what I
give it character.
It's an interesting concept because I think about when I have kids, I'm like, how do I, say everything works out and we're super successful and all those things, like how do you raise your children where they don't feel like they have money, right? Because
I think that's hard, right?
I think it's super hard.
And I don't want to tangent too much.
Yeah, right.
But the old saying, hard times create soft men.
No, hard times create strong men.
Hard times create hard men or strong men. Strong men create soft times.
Yeah.
Soft times create soft men.
Yeah.
Soft men create hard times.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's absolutely true, and I see it. And it was interesting having gone to SMU and meeting a lot of those. I basically kind of adopted into that whole network and everything like that, and especially being in oil and gas as well. Like, you kind of get around some folks who are generational in their dollars, and I don't want to call it all wealth because they weren't all generationally wealthy, but definitely comfortable, very comfortable. And it was interesting meeting all those folks and then getting introduced to contacts that they had and being able to monetize those relationships and those introductions where the person that introduced me should have and could have done the same thing, but not the perspective of need was different, right? So, or need to make something happen.
Right. Now, is it really your MBA contacts or your Arlington contacts that kind of led you into getting into cannabis?
Oh, well, industrial materials, really.
Industrial materials.
Right.
Sorry. But when I met you, you were in oil and gas.
Right.
But then one day we talked. And I'm like,
yeah.
Why is he involved with a company called Imperial Seedling?
Yeah.
And so that was really the switch for me.
Uh-huh.
Because I always identified you with oil and gas.
Yeah.
So well, tell me about that. How'd you get into that?
So, in oil and gas, so I was, at the time that we spoke, I believe that was with Toro Capital. So, I was a co-founder in Toro Capital, and we were, out there, project funding oil and gas projects. Okay. And so deals were coming across the desk all the time. And a deal came across, and it was interesting because in oil and gas at that time, you were hearing some of the engineers in oil and gas talk about biofuels, alternative fuel sources, and because you have to be looking at those things, right? In the industry and what's coming around. And although at the time, no one really took it seriously because people were basically going into restaurants and getting their leftover oil and trying to make that biodiesel out of it and stuff like that. So no one really took it seriously. But anyway, I had a deal come across my desk that was in the cannabis hemp world, and it obviously wasn't oil and gas, and so I kind of started going toward that direction, and the people involved were some big names, and so I decided, because I looked at oil and gas and the direction it was going, and I think oil and gas industry is amazing. I think it's amazing what the oil and gas industry has done. I think even though I've personally moved on into a bio-based realm, right? Non-fossil fuel. I think it's super important to tip the hat, to the shoulders of giants that we stand on, and say, hey, oil and gas, you got us to where we're at now.
So what I'm hearing is that it sounds like there's a lot of crossover, or at least there's some crossover between the skill set that you developed in the oil and gas industry and the bio-industrial materials.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I kind of see it as a relay race, right? Everyone had their section in time, and oil and gas, they came out and they did their thing, and they really, without oil and gas, everything that we look at, everything whether it be the gasoline we put in the car, the plastic container we use, all these other things, the makeup, it's been in everything. And look, there's all these conspiracies and theories about how they got into those industries, but nonetheless, right, they have provided a lot of value. And so I think that their time has come, and we can't turn oil and gas off today. We can't. Elon Musk will tell you, do not turn off oil and gas. There's not enough electricity to power these cars, right? Sure. So anyway, I got into, actually what ended up happening is before Imperial Seedlings, Imperial Seedlings was the result of farming. So first we got into industrial hemp farming. Okay. And so we ended up farming about 500 acres of hemp in Nevada. And so, which at the time was one of the largest farms nationwide, and definitely in the state of Nevada. I think it was the largest farm in Nevada.
But why did you pick Nevada, though? of all states?
Well, so we were growing at the time floral hemp.
Okay.
So while my focus, well, while my interest lied in industrial materials, there was no way that the world was ready for that yet. Like everyone's been talking about hemp and fiber and all these other things. And initially, like when I was hearing about it, like I heard a biofuel, I heard rope, I heard like things that like biofuel was super interesting to me, but like rope and some of these other textiles were less at the time. And so, but in floral hemp, there's a lot of risks to mitigate for.
Like what?
Like first of all, humidity and bugs are huge issues.
Sure.
Because you can look at the flowers of hemp, you know, in the layman's terms, you know, you call them buds, right? So the buds of the flower or the buds of the plant are just like any fruit of any plant, right? Super interesting to bugs. And then the way that the flower is structured, so it's an upward trending bract structure, right? And so the way you basically have V's going up, and within those V's, and it's a tight little space, you get moisture. And then when you get moisture in there, and it can't really escape because it's tight, it starts to mold, right? And so we picked Nevada because of a couple things.
It's dry.
It's dry, right? Super dry. And at the time, my business partner, Jeffrey, he had a long stint in the cannabis industry. Okay. And honestly, you know, he was kind of the reason why I had the confidence to go forward and do the farm.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because coming from the oil and gas industry, I mean, you had to have some reticence about getting into cannabis because because of the traditional stigma that surrounds it, especially at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is a couple years back. But if nothing else, it's an industry that you were not entirely familiar with.
Right.
But for your business partner, from what it sounds like, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
So tell me about like any type of concerns or any challenges for you personally on when you got into it.
Yeah. So like you said, right, the big stigma at the time, you know, and getting into cannabis really wasn't necessarily the end game. You know, like I said, industrial materials, alternative energy sources, all that stuff was super interesting to me. But when it caught my eye, like I said, it wasn't ready. So instead, you start looking at the family of plants, right? So the Cannabaceae genus of plants. So the Cannabaceae genus of plants is hemp, cannabis, hops, by the way, and randomly tumbleweed. But there's a couple
really?
others. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
I know.
Tumbleweed?
I know. Yeah, it's kind of weird, right? So anyway, so I met some guys in the project that I left the oil and gas business for failed miserably, actually, after about a year. And so I got into basically management consulting, and I ended up getting into management consulting in the cannabis industry first because the hemp industry hadn't really come to light yet because Farm Bill 2018 hadn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And so
because that didn't happen until December of 2018.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if it was December, but I know it was 2018.
Yeah, it was December 20th of 2018. That's when it passed.
Yeah, nice. So so then within that management consulting, I met Jeffrey.
Ah, okay.
And I was we were talking about, and he was running a cannabis company in Washington at the time. Okay. And I was talking to him about my interest in the industrial hemp side, and I was helping them out with some project funding and recapitalization of the company and stuff like that, having come from the capital markets world. Mm-hmm. And so I asked him, I said, "Hey, what are your thoughts? What's the opportunity right now?" And he said, "Oh, I think it's CBD." And I was like, "Cool, what's CBD?" So anyway, he kind of described it to me, and he was like, "So basically, it's kind of a combination of the two worlds, right? My interest in the industrial material side, and cannabis. So you're dealing with a non-psychoactive cannabinoid, which was CBD at the time. And so that's how we got into it. And so we fundraised and launched, and we grew all this material. And in the process, I forgot one very important concept:
What's that?
selling the end product, right? Like,
Yeah, you grew it, but
Yeah.
now you have to do something with the biomass, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what are you gonna do with after you grow it?
right.
Yeah.
So that was a problem for us, and it was so hot, and everyone's talking about it. Like, as a person who has run sales organizations in multiple industries, it's a bit embarrassing that I really didn't think about the end first and work backward. But it's what
Learning
happened.
experience.
It's what happened. And so anyway, and then Imperial Seedlings, and I'll like come back to that concept in a moment. But Imperial Seedlings was essentially solving for a small problem we had in farming. So when we were trying to get started, we only had X number of dollars, right? And to cover 500 acres at 2,500, 3,000 plants an acre, that's a lot of plants.
Yeah.
And at the time, I had learned so much from Jeffrey because he's a fourth generation farmer, growing, tree fruits, wine grapes, hops, and a number of other items through his family. And I had learned a ton of things. And one of the things that I learned was that seedlings are usually about 10 cents, right? Sometimes 5, depending on where you're at. They were $7 to $10 in the hemp
Out in the
industry.
open market?
In the hemp industry.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
meaning out in the open market, meaning
Yeah.
if you were selling seedlings, you can sell it between $7 to $10 per seedling.
Yeah, at least that's what they were trying to charge, right? And they weren't coming off of it. And so, like for us, what we ended up, our solution was we ended up farming 500 acres, and a portion of that was a dairy farm. And so it's got these long strips of concrete, and we called it the Green Mile because we basically just put seedlings all the way down this concrete strip. It's where all the cows would come and feed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we just had it was really kind of a cool sight, and we took an aerial view. But no, we ended up launching Imperial Seedlings to solve that problem, right? It was just a quick little thing, and a quick little thing turned into like kind of a decent sized business for us. We sold 3.5 million seedlings across the United States in 2020, and so it was definitely a very good.
Were you able to charge the $7 to $10
no,
per
our whole
seedling?
concept was dollar starts.
Really?
Yeah.
So you're depending more on volume on your seedlings versus the high charge per seedling.
Yeah,
model.
and being farmer focused, right? So that was our big thing. Was like,
I mean, in some ways, it was kind of an altruistic approach to the hemp industry.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of was. And, we also wanted to make sure that we were there for the farmer. Like everyone else was there to try to take advantage of the farmer. And,
Sure.
and it happens in every industry. Farmer gets, squeezed.
Right.
And, this is a passion that I have now. And again, I thank Jeffrey for that, because that's where that came from. And because he explained to me how these things work. And, so anyway, so then what we ended up doing is because we had farmed so much acreage and learned so many lessons in that, because we initially took basically Jeffrey's background in cannabis, because he'd been growing cannabis since the legal market in Washington State, 97.
Okay.
Right, in 1997, you could deliver cannabis. And I think that's how that story goes. But anyway. And his story is super interesting, terminally ill at 15, cannabis kind of saved his life, actually,
no
and was prescribed unofficially by his doctor. His doctor,
as early as 97.
Yeah, his doctor actually literally wrote his mom a script.
That's how
Gave him a contact.
Okay, that's actually how I fell into the cannabis industry back in 13. My first client was. Question was, how do I, what are the physician liabilities prescribing versus recommending medical cannabis?
Right.
So it's interesting that he was actually involved with it from what it sounds like around 15. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. When he was 15, because he's 43, 44 now.
Yeah.
But no, he had been given a terminal diagnosis, like you're going to die. And so like his doctor gave his mom a contact and was like, hey, go get this cannabis. He's going to need it because there's a experimental surgery that we can do, and but he doesn't have the weight he needs right now. He's not eating, and he's really sick, and so the doctors would wheel him down to the showers, which were under construction at the time at the hospital, because his mom went and got the cannabis and brought it back. And super interesting story. And he was able to gain enough weight, start eating again, got healthy enough to have the surgery, and was like, it was literally a 1 out of 100 type of experimental surgery. In terms of 1 out of 100 success rate.
I mean, that, the stigmatized route at the time, especially, more or less saved his life.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, so he immediately gained a passion for it. And he also grew up in an area where hops were very prominent. So Washington State is one of the epicenters of hops production globally.
Okay.
But with hops and cannabis being in the same genus of plants, family of plants, then he would actually graft cannabis onto like hops vines growing up and stuff like that. So
wow, you can do that.
Yeah, because they're the same family, right?
Yeah.
Same genetics.
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, it's super. It's anyway, fun facts. But anyway, so that's kind of how we got into growing that, and then we basically, and Jeffrey had done a ton of studying of the applicable crossovers of input programs, fertilizers, pest management programs, stuff like that, in cannabis with some larger scale fertilizer companies. And they were actually in hops. And so he was studying the applicable crossovers in those programs, right? Those tried and true and proven concepts. But anyway, so that's how we were able to scale that. But
you spun off and did other things too for after Imperial Seedling, right?
Yeah, Imperial Seedlings was just kind of we just saw a problem. We decided to solve it, right?
Okay.
And then, so we did that. Sold a bunch of seedlings, and then we launched Elevated Distributing, and that was
still with Jeffrey. Okay,
yeah.
So he stayed with you on the distribution side too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually,
tell me about.
We're
Elevated.
still partners today. So
okay.
Yeah. So we got into we launched Elevated Distributing as a concept of trying to as a go-to-market strategy for trying to connect or bring the two ends together of farmers and the market. Because there was no market. And when you look at anything else, like any other crop, there's an established market, established Silk Road, if you will, of taking things to market, and whether that's buying it off the stock or buying it at the farm or a central marketplace, for the farmers to all bring their products. Right. That exists in every other crop. It didn't exist in hemp, and really doesn't still to this day. And so we decided we were going to basically go semi-create that and basically and take it to market. And we had some success in that, but we quickly, so while we were doing it Elevated, we were still paying attention very much to the industrial side, right? Of fiber and cellulose, which is where we wanted to be. In 2020, August 2020, the U.S. launched the U.S. Plastics Pact, 2025 U.S. Plastics Pact, which basically has 3 primary pillars. And the one that was most interesting to us was the one that said that by 2025, 30% of all plastics will be bio-based. And so...
But did they define what, and I'm not familiar with that particular mandate, but did they define what bio-based means?
Right, non-synthetic, right?
Okay, so you couldn't actually synthetically manufacture the plastic like how plastic is traditionally manufactured.
Right, right. That's exactly right. So, so it would be all bio-based, and then there's 2 other pillars, and one's about recycling and being compostable and stuff like that. And then what's interesting is, so that was launched by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in tandem with the U.S. But the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has launched plastics pacts, similar plastics pacts, across 10 different countries and regions. So you've got a Canadian plastic pact, you got a European plastic pact, you got Australian, even Kenya's got a plastics pact. And so that was super interesting and really caught our attention. And that was during the time of Imperial Seedlings. And then in, I want to say April of 21, while we were doing Elevated, that's whenever the SEC was starting to release the proposals for the new regulation around ESG. And so, because while we had this interest in these bio-based industrial materials, what mattered was why now, right? There was not a why now. There was no compelling event.
But with ESG, you answer that question. Part of it.
ESG in tandem with, consumer development and basically what they care about, right?
Yeah.
So consumers are starting to get to a point where they're willing to pay an extra $1 for their toilet paper or this or that, and so like it's more consumers are more conscious than they used to be. But anyway, so basically, long story short, so the SEC and the ESG thing, why that was interesting is because back in 2018-ish, you started having like all these, and within the capital markets and fund managers across the world, you had about $300 trillion between 18 and 21, 22. You had about $300 trillion of assets under management basically signify or basically dedicate to sustainability. And because they were signing up and signing petitions of a dedication to sustainability, you had all these major pubcos and corporations across the world say, hey, we're sustainable, or we're going to be. And so companies, and I won't drop any names here, but all these major Fortune 500s are going, hey, we're going to reduce our forest fiber consumption by 50% by 2025. Or we're going to reduce our petrochemical plastic utilization by 50% by 2025. Okay. Super aggressive timelines. And by doing that, they are essentially attracting those assets under that AUM, those assets under management, those capital markets at $300 trillion. It says we're going to buy stocks of companies that are being sustainable. Right. And so, and of course, it's unknown. I don't know if they also did it because that drives consumer behavior. I don't know how much consumers are paying attention to sustainability claims of companies, but investors sure are.
Do you think ESG is going to, I guess the force and momentum of ESG is going to continue, where it obviously has a driving force on consumerism, mm-hmm. how companies are formulated, the people that you bring on to the companies? Do you see that as being sustainable over the next, say, 10 years as a major driving force, as it is today, or is it going to be bigger, in your opinion?
So, in my opinion, I think that the cat's kind of out of the bag on this one. The genie's out of the bottle. Mm-hmm. There's way too much momentum at this point, and it's not just ESG, to be clear, right? Yeah. ESG is the regulatory side. So basically what the SEC did, what the European Commission did, is they came out and said, hey, look, you're making these claims of sustainability. Mm-hmm. You're driving investor behavior. So because you're making claims that drive investor behavior, that needs to be regulated. And you've got no accountability, which is where the whole concept of greenwashing came from. And by the way, I'll quickly interject that we ended up launching Cellulogyx right out of Elevated Distributing to go. We just dropped everything we were doing. We still run Imperial Seedlings 2 months out of the year, and we still do a little bit in Elevated, but
Is Elevated, does it serve, the more I'm learning about Elevated and what you guys do on Elevated, it sounds like to me it's almost like a biomass brokerage firm, to where you aggregate biomass and then you put it out into open market.
That's essentially what it was.
Okay.
Yeah. Elevated today doesn't really do much because Elevated grew up into Cellulogyx, basically. Yeah. So I'll get into Cellulogyx in a moment, but so going back to the ESG thing, so the SEC said, hey, look, we're going to regulate this, and we're going to make sure that that the claims that you're making to drive investor behavior are true. And there's no standard for ESG reporting. And so there are some companies like Kimberly-Clark, for example, they have been voluntarily putting out their ESG reports for years now. And they're one of the companies that have made a lot of these claims about 2025. And by the way, a company like Kimberly-Clark, they consume about 5.2 billion pounds of wood pulp annually. 5.2 billion pounds. And I'll get into like really what wood pulp is in a moment, but if they're going to replace 50% of that, you're talking about 2.6 billion pounds of an alternative resource. Yeah. That's a huge gap to fill.
How would they even get the resources to fill that gap? Is there even enough resource to fill that gap?
Hence the birth of Cellulogyx.
Yeah.
Right? We saw this major problem here of going, these companies are making all these claims, and I'm not here to say that they aren't sincere about it. Like, they very likely are. But what I do know is that I went into a very deep wormhole in understanding like what fills that gap. And so far as I can tell, there's not one. So you can make all these claims that you want, and you can actually mean it when you say it. But if there's not a solution for you, then you got a problem. So then I started looking at, okay, so if all these companies are going to replace 50% of their wood pulp, and they're going to replace 50% of their petrochemical plastics, right? Mm-hmm. Plastic isn't going away. Plastic is amazing. Plastic has made our world fantastic and convenient. But if we're going to replace petrochemical plastic, well, what do we replace that with? And so I started diving into the science of making paper and making plastic and making biofuel and concrete, and like these areas that are getting the most negative attention in terms of sustainability, world changing, all this other stuff. So I looked at, and then I discovered that the basic building block of all these items are to some degree polymers. And I was like, what's the most abundant polymer in the world, naturally occurring? It's cellulose. So, look, and I'm going to be really honest. At the time that I discovered this, I didn't even know what cellulose really was. And so I started diving deep.
So tell me, what is cellulose? And it sounds like cellulose exists in hemp.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of cellulose in hemp, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And my understanding, based on what you just now told me, is that it sounds like Cellulogyx is really the genesis and the entryway in your world of how you got into the industrial materials. Because if you think about it, Imperial Seedlings is Imperial Seedlings. You sold seedlings for a living, right? You farmed before. Mm-hmm. That's still, leading up to that, you got into Elevated, which you could either call it a distribution company or a biomass brokerage firm,
right?
However way you want to describe it. It was really Cellulogyx that really kind of got you into the industrial hemp / industrial materials game.
Yes.
Using cellulose, I'm assuming fiber.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's where you start differentiating between floral fiber and fiber or hemp fiber, right?
Yeah.
And based on my prior conversation with you, is that you have the V buds, and at this point with industrial hemp, you don't really want the buds anymore.
No, not at all.
In fact, it's almost like a nuisance in some ways.
Yeah, that's exactly right, actually. And so we, and you're right, Cellulogyx was our final, like, we're officially diving in.
Yeah.
Like we're like nothing else matters anymore. And like Cellulogyx and the industrial materials piece is where our focus is. And it was almost celebratory, right? And like being like, it's finally here.
Yeah.
Right? It was super exciting for all of us.
Because it was a waiting game for you for a while.
Right. It was. And so, but something that's crucially important to understand is that when we dove into this, we didn't call it a hemp company, and we still don't today, right? We call it industrial materials, right? We call ourselves a cellulose and fiber company, focus on those items, but because we took our hemp hat off when we were starting Cellulogyx, and we said, okay, hemp isn't the answer per se. It's cellulose and it's fiber. Okay?
Which comes out of the hemp.
Right, it does.
Right.
But there are a number of places you can get cellulose. Right? So that's really where we had to start. Is like, if cellulose is the answer, and fiber as well, but cellulose with a higher intensity of focus, if that's the answer to all of these things, then where do we get it from? I hope the answer is hemp, right? But let's not be...
Well, where does Cellulogyx get their cellulose from? Is it entirely hemp, or do you get your cellulose from other places or other sources?
It's entirely hemp, right?
Okay.
But it wasn't a myopic focus of being like,
right,
we've been in hemp this whole time and da-da-da. So we took our hemp hat off, and we said, because you can get cellulose. Cotton has got a ton of cellulose.
Okay.
90%. Flax, ramie, jute, bamboo. You can get it from all these different...
All those sources are more expensive.
Not necessarily more expensive, but when you look at... So you have to break it down into like the growing, first of all. So like hemp, okay, so like you got birth and death, right? So of these plants. And so hemp, while it's growing, it's a remediation plant. It actually cleanses the soil.
That's what the Russians and the Chinese did overseas when they had high levels of metals and mercury in their soil. They used to plant hemp into their soil.
Yeah.
And it would suck up all the mercury in different types of nasty metals.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the problem was that they used to take that same hemp, sell it at a cheap amount on the open market, and people were using that dirty hemp to create subsequently dirty materials that people were consuming.
Of course. Yeah.
So,
well, they did the same thing at Chernobyl,
Oh, did they?
Yeah.
With the whole radiation thing.
Yeah. So I actually went out to Ukraine, Kiev, back in 2019, I think it was. 2020, I believe.
You said Chernobyl, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Russians were planting hemp into the ground to clean up the radiation.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Ukrainians,
I didn't know that.
but yeah.
Ukrainians.
Yeah. So I went out there specifically to meet with some groups who wanted to launch hemp programs within Ukraine, because they were really good at industrial hemp, right? Fibrous hemp. But they didn't know much about floral hemp. And so we were going to go help them launch, a multi-thousand acre floral hemp program. And so Kiev's, by the way, a beautiful city. And
is it?
Yeah.
Worth visiting?
Well, probably not right now. I'd probably give it some time, but
right.
Yeah,
right.
and the Ukrainian people were fantastic, and we just had a really great time, and went and saw a bunch of stuff. But then they showed us kind of where they had planted all this hemp to clean up around Chernobyl. So I don't think that they turned around and sold it to people, but at least they didn't for that one. But it was definitely interesting. But it's a remediation plant. So, and it cleans up the soils. What it also does is it sequesters CO2. So it sequesters about 7 tons per acre of CO2 per season. So per planting, right? And 7 tons, when you look at the carbon market, is not a lot, right? But when you start to expand the cultivation across thousands of acres, it starts to add up significantly. And so we looked at that. We looked at the amount of cellulose. And by the way, not all celluloses are made the same. Not all cellulose.
I would imagine, because I would imagine the cellulose from, say, cotton, as you said, maybe the consistency at least, or the strength of the cellulose may be different than, say, hemp or flax and so forth.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
And I'm not a scientist.
So,
obviously.
you know what? I'm not either. But so it took me probably a lot longer to learn all this than someone who's more scientifically focused. But, we started diving into cellulose content, tensile strength, which is the strength of it. You got Young's modulus and elongation, which are basically measurements of elasticity. You have the crystallinity index. You've got crystallinity percentage. You've got all these characteristics. And so we built a matrix of all these plants and all these categories in the columns and like really analyze this. And at the bottom of the page, hemp came out, fortunately, the best, right?
The most viable or the
Had
strongest?
the best combination of categorical characteristics, right?
What does that mean?
So like, okay, tensile strength, the strength of it. It was one of the strongest.
Okay.
When you look at elasticity, it had just the right amount, which, by the way, hops is a really interesting cellulose because it's highly elastic.
But is it strong enough?
It's not nearly as strong as hemp, but you have to look at it as a per application piece, right?
Okay.
So we don't call ourselves a hemp company because we have hemp cellulose for this application and hop cellulose for that application, and we're still learning so much about the cellulose of each plant that we have a long way to go.
That's fascinating. So I'm just thinking out loud here is that because my understanding based on our prior discussions is you can put cellulose, for example, to mix in with concrete.
Yeah.
And it's a binding agent.
Yes.
Right. Cellulose is a binding agent. So if you were to put hemp cellulose into concrete as a binding agent versus say, flax or something else, that the consistency of the concrete may be different.
Absolutely.
Or the viability of the concrete may be different. One may be more susceptible to cracking or shattering versus another.
Yeah, and absorption, right?
Yeah.
So absorption rates. If one like absorbs and it like contracts and retracts, and if you don't want stuff changing in your concrete, really, right? So those are components. And then,
is that the elasticity part that you're saying?
No, elasticity is like being able to mold and move without breaking.
Yeah.
Right. You don't want your polymers to break. You don't want anyway. So. It's super interesting. And then also you have to look at the cellulose content relative to other things like lignin. So lignin so when you make paper, people are like, oh, paper's made out of wood. Well, kind of, right? So what they do is they take the trees, they chop them up, they chip them up, put them in this big old crock pot called a digester, and essentially use that to pull. And they use chemicals and all kinds of stuff to pull the cellulose out, which is the target compound, and then get rid of the lignin. So lignin is something that you don't want. The more lignin you have, the more processing it requires.
So is it more expensive if you have a high lignin content?
It is. Yeah. And it's also much more hazardous to the environment because you have to use way more chemicals. And so in paper, they use a process called kraft pulping. And kraft pulping is highly involves a ton of chemicals, and it's really bad for the environment. And it's also expensive. And so with a hemp-derived cellulose or even hemp fiber, so depending on which part of the hemp stalk you're taking, but you have much less lignin. You don't need kraft pulping. And there's some research that alludes to the fact that it's basically, to grossly understate it, it's basically using hydrogen peroxide, and it's and you can start getting to your core stuff, and so they take all the cellulose and then they make wood pulp out of that, right? Yep. And so and then they'll flatten it and make paper, and that's how paper is made and stuff like that. But but we can use a plant-derived cellulose, and when we relate hemp in that specific application in paper, in 1 acre of hemp, I can produce 4 times more cellulose than 1 acre of forest on average, right? And I get to grow that every year.
Right.
A hardwood takes 10 years to grow. Softwood takes 20. Let's use the hardwood. So if you and I are competing to sell to a paper mill, right? You're growing trees, I'm growing hemp. In our first year, you harvest the trees, I harvest hemp, 1 acre. I got 4 times more cellulose, right? Now you're going to wait 10 more years before your next trees are ready. In that time, I've had 9 more harvests. So 4 times per acre over 10 years. I'm 40 times more cellulose.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I had learned that hemp grows anywhere between 3 to 5 inches a day in some circumstances, or
Yeah.
something crazy like that. It grows almost like a weed.
Like a weed.
Yeah. Is that true?
Well, so it really depends. It's really variable on your microclimate and your soil types, right?
Okay.
What you have going on. Are you dryland farming, irrigation? And like I said, in total, if you plant in end of May, early June, you're going to harvest sometime in October, right?
Okay.
So over those 4 or 5 months,
Right.
and you're looking to get your plants anywhere from 10 to 15 feet tall. They're growing like bamboo.
Right. And that's different from the floral. The floral
Very,
only
very.
grows about 6 feet or
6
so?
feet ish, yeah, right. 2,500 to 3,500 plants an acre. But yeah, so it's very, very different. But the fact that we can grow that much more cellulose, and then when you talk about bioplastics, let's cover that for a quick second. So first of all, start with the problem. I think what we're really talking about is basically major impact on the natural world, whether it be sea animals, humans. We've all seen the turtle with the straw, and we've all seen like the birds with the Coke netting around them and all that other stuff, right? So let's not try to pull at the heartstrings to make our point. Let's back it up into just how we're being affected as human beings. So as human beings, we've got this major problem of sperm count, fertility, basically. So there's a really interesting study. When we were talking, you said you really liked Joe Rogan, right?
Yeah.
I'm a huge Joe Rogan fan.
Right.
And so I love his podcast, I love his style, and I just love his approach, really, more than anything. Because he seems very open-minded. But he had a guest, and I meant to capture her name. I forgot her name, but she's a researcher and a writer. And she did the really interesting research program where she was studying the length of a man's taint.
That's one heck of a
I mean, I don't know how that
study.
study works out. Like,
Okay.
what was that process? Like, is it from the front? I don't know. But anyway, so I know it's really funny research. But what she was studying was the direct correlation between the length of a man's taint and his sperm count and fertility rates.
What was that? What was the result of that?
The shorter the taint, the lower the fertility.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
Now, what's add the other piece of that, which is super interesting. The higher the amount of microplastics found in a man's body, the shorter the taint.
So you're saying consumption of the micro the micro materials can alter a man's physiological appearance, one, and then internally the internal physiology with, I guess in this case, the sperm count.
Right, and the ability to reproduce, yeah.
Which comes full circle, right? Is that putting in alternative materials that's bio-based in the industrial materials world has a direct impact on the public health aspect of human beings.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so it's about being biodegradable. Plastics are degradable. They degrade down
at a very slow rate.
Microplastics.
At a very slow rate, right?
Yeah, but they can degrade they can degrade rapidly, but they never biodegrade, right? So which means that the nature has not developed microbes to biodegrade it back into the earth. So the reason why is that when you use petrochemical plastics, it's a carbon-carbon bond, right? And that carbon-carbon bond is extremely strong. And we're going to get a little sciencey for a moment, right? And I'll try not to go too deep, but so that carbon-carbon bond is extremely, extremely difficult to break. When you look at petrochemicals, oil, you look at it and say, the world has been really good the earth is really good at absorbing things back into it, right? It never did that with oil. It collected. It's like the leftovers that it couldn't biodegrade. And so, but we're taking this thing that the world doesn't know, the earth does not know how to biodegrade, and we're making stuff out of it. And so, with that carbon-carbon bond, you can't break it. And then if you can't break it, then the microbes, the Earth's naturally produced microbes, cannot break it down because it can't break that bond. Now, when you look at a bio-based material, everything that's bio-based, everything that's made by nature, has got a carbon-hydrogen bond, a carbon-oxygen bond, which is a weaker bond, but it allows the penetration of the microbes to allow it to biodegrade it back into the earth. So a bioplastic is not a carbon-carbon bond, so it's a polymer, right? It's a long-string polymer. It's not a carbon-carbon bond, so it's a carbon-hydrogen, carbon-oxygen bond that allows it to be, when it's within the, like if you put it on the ground, there are natural microbes that are going to get in there and tear it apart, eat it up, right? And scientists are trying to come up with microbes. They're trying to develop microbes right now that will eat through a carbon-carbon bond, and which is great to solve our current problem, right? But from a going forward perspective, maybe let's not put stuff out there that can't be broken down. So we're talking anywhere from a few hundred years to 1,000 years to break down plastic. So it's a serious problem. Okay, so fine. If that's the problem, well, we have two solutions. It's either get rid of all things plastic,
which we're not going to do.
Seems highly unlikely. Yeah. Or make it out of a material that can be biodegradable, right? And you have...
it gets absorbed back into the earth.
Right. Whether it's in the marine, whether it ends up in the water, which obviously it's a huge problem. And, people that are really hitting it hard in the plastics world will be like, hey, we got the Great Pacific Patch. You ever heard of that?
Yep.
Yeah, that's, the garbage patch that's out, between basically California and Hawaii, and it's the size of
it's an island.
It's an island.
It's
right?
an island itself.
Yeah, and you look at it, and it's got a ridiculous amount of, and like the plastic that they're measuring is just on the surface, right? And which is some huge number that I can't think of right now. But what's interesting is that like you've got just as much, if not more, of that plastic on the floor right there below. Mm-hmm. So, anyways, so that's a major problem. And so, and the folks that are talking about that are all, they scream about that. But I look at it like, okay, we need to solve that problem. But how do we fix it going forward? And if petrochemical plastics are not it, and we're still going to keep plastics, then let's make it out of something different. So when I dove into plastics and discovered that cellulose is really, you have two things. You have cellulose and starch. Most bio-based plastics to date, as far as I can tell, are typically made out of starch because they were making them out of corn, right? So corn starch or sugar cane or agave, things like that, and you're making out of the starch. But when you talk about that carbon-hydrogen bond and those bonds between glucose, the starch one is actually a lot weaker than the bonds within cellulose. And so we can make resilient plastics out of biomaterial. Yeah. And so the hard part now is, so if we've got that, and then we're, like you mentioned, concrete, and we've got biofuel. We can make biofuel, really, we can make a cellulosic ethanol out of cellulose, obviously. And so all these things are great, right? But the problem was, how can you ever make something out of a material that's not widely available? So that was the problem that's the problem that we're
the availability of the source of the resources.
Right.
And keep in mind, right, hemp's only been federally legal for not even 5 years.
Right. Which is why a lot of your bio-based materials are not made out of hemp, right? It's not typically found. Right. But, so when we look at this, now it's about, okay, we've got to get adoption and demand. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that so earlier you asked a question, and I want to come back to it. Like you said, hey, you basically asked how permanent is ESG or sustainability and stuff like that. So with all the plastics packs we have around the world, we have the World Wildlife Fund that's doing amazing things. the Earth Defense Fund, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and these organizations are global and they're big and they're moving. And then you've got, when you talk about the plastics pacts, it's called a pact for a reason. And you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of some of the biggest corporations in the world signing up for it. Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, Johnson Controls, Kimberly-Clark that we mentioned earlier, Coca-Cola.
And they're funding this monetarily too, aren't they?
They're putting a lot of money into it.
Right. That's why it's a pact.
Yeah.
So
Coca-Cola, they were super excited about a bio-based bottle that they came out with some years ago.
I remember that actually.
Yeah. But the thing about it is, remember that carbon-carbon bond I was talking about? If you're not 100% plant-based, then you're encapsulated in this carbon-carbon bond petrochemical plastic. So they were doing, I think they were at 30% bio-based, or I can't remember the percentage now. But if it doesn't matter if you're 70% bio-based, you're encapsulated in the petrochemical plastics of this carbon-carbon bond, and you still have that 500 or 1,000 year biodegrade timeline.
Right. So, I mean, even though you're 70% the bio, that the existence of the 30% still maintains or preserves that carbon-carbon bond that you're saying.
Exactly. And so that's why Coca-Cola finally was celebrating the fact that they finally came out with 100% plant-based bottle.
Got it.
I think they called it the plant bottle, right? And not only did they do that, but they made it open source to a ton of their competitors. And
talk about some ESG credits, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so, I don't think you're putting this genie back in the bottle, but what we are going to have to do is to have a lot of these companies. The problem right now is pound for pound, whether it's wood pulp or petrochemical plastics, right? Or petrochemical for plastic creation, pound for pound, we're still more expensive. Now we're working on fixing that through some very advanced processing technologies that get away from a lot of the old mechanical processing practices. It's kind of cool, actually. We can take hemp stalk and turn it into a dry sanitized powder within 1/1000th of a second.
Wow, no kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Utilizing sound waves and resonance. But anyways, it's super kind of cool, and it's technically like ultrasonication, but. So we're trying to fix the processing so we can take some cost out of there. But if I'm, pound for pound, we're more expensive. So it's going to take, to some degree, the companies and the corporations saying we'll pay more, right? What's also happening is the government, the USDA, over the last, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it's over the last 18 months, has either deployed or committed to deploy 3.1 billion pounds into 141 different projects based on smart commodities. Okay. Hemp is a major piece of that.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, let me spin off into one last question because we're running out of time here. Is that what do you see in one line is the future of the industrial materials industry as it relates to hemp and hemp only?
Hemp only. Well, I mean, given its versatility, I think we're working toward a totally circular economy, right? Hemp is a net negative carbon footprint plant, and so the world is working toward a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Right. And I think that specific to hemp, I think, and really I want to say all bio-based, but you asked about hemp specifically. I think hemp gets us there a lot faster. Okay. Giving its versatility and ability in application. So I think that's where we're headed. We're headed to net zero and a total circular economy and using bio-based materials.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, thanks for making the time to come on the Sativa segment.
It's good to see you again, man.
Yeah, it's always good to see you. We haven't seen each other for a while.
Yeah, so. I know. We should fix that.
Always.
Yeah.
All right, man.
All right,
well, this is it, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.